Educating HG, Part 4. Hello, I'm HG Tudor. I continue to provide you with recollections from when I was at school to help you understand more about me, the narcissistic psychopath, and the interactions that I had during the period of my education. You'll recall that I was appointed as deputy head boy in the final year of my education at secondary school, a position that I was pleased with, as it gave me certain operational advantages compared to the merely ceremonial, which was the more boring role that was reserved for the head boy. One of my responsibilities as deputy head boy was that I was given a set of keys, which enabled me to access various stockrooms and storerooms that were dotted around the school. The idea behind this was that on 3 set days a week, I would facilitate the provision of new exercise books to those who had already filled theirs. This meant that the relevant pupil would queue at an appointed time outside a particular stockroom, and then I would provide them with a new exercise book. The books were different colours: red for maths, dark blue for English, light blue for chemistry, orange for geography, pink for history, and so forth. I found it rather odd that they were colour-coded, given the fact that the geography exercise book and a history exercise book, or an English exercise book, well, one would be writing in them in the same way. Why did they need to be different? Furthermore, pupils were encouraged to undertake the process of backing their books to protect them, whereby they would either use some form of clear material or, more usually, a poster of a pop star or a football team to back the book and give it to their own individual flavour. This meant, of course, that you weren't able to see the colour underneath, unless, of course, you had used some shiny plastic backing. Anyway, this was the process, and therefore, as alleviating some of the tasks that the teachers would ordinarily discharge, it was given to me as the deputy head boy, so that I would then dispense these new books. A queue would form at the appointed time, and then I would come strolling along, almost like a jailer, ready to free the prisoners. Naturally, I savoured the fact that people were waiting on me. It fuelled me. I would arrive at the door, take out the long key, insert it, whilst looking along the line of expectant faces. I would turn the key, open the door. There would be a slight movement forward as they attempted to start the process, which of course I immediately halted by entering the stockroom and closing the door behind me. I flicked on the light and drew in the scent of all of those stacked exercise books, as I then picked up a pen and opened the door, ready for business. All that would need to be done, it was a simple process, was that for the relevant pupil would present a book. I would then have to flick through it to make sure that pages had not been torn from it. If they were, I would then look at them with an arched eyebrow, inviting them to explain why pages had been removed, and to check that it was indeed full. In some instances, a page or two might not yet have been filled, and I'd be met with a protest, "But I'll fill them soon, I wanted to have one available just in case." I would savour pausing, looking them over, letting the silence hang, watching their nervous reaction. It was ridiculous, really. It was just in relation to getting an exercise book, but it shows just how power can be wielded at so many different levels. Naturally, those that I favoured, the attractive girls in my year, I barely looked at what's contained in the book. I simply flicked through it while staring at them, subjecting them to my laser-like gaze, my blue eyes looking upon them, drinking them in, looking for a signal that told me that they were interested, something that I would then later exploit. It was a useful siphoning process. I revelled in those that I didn't like, rejecting them, pointing out that there must have been a torn page and causing them to express their dissatisfaction, suggesting that they come back on another day. And for those that I favoured, their coquettish grins as I looked them up and down and then handed them a book. It was necessary for me to place my initials at the back of the book that had been filled so that people could not come back a second time. Though quite why they would do so, it's not as if there was going to be an illicit trade in the selling of exercise books, but there we are. Nevertheless, this little bit of power that was afforded to me by this process, which I utilise for the identification of potential female victims, paled compared to its other usefulness. And that was in relation to interaction with those said girls. The school that I attended to was big on segregation. The way that it worked, there was a yard for the first years, both boys and girls, so that those baby-faced, fresh individuals who were embarking on secondary school life were supposedly protected from the big bad world of the second, third, fourth years. The fifth years had their own block and rarely ventured outside, and ordinarily, at break times, would be frequenting indoors. For the second, third, and fourth years, the boys were placed in a yard. It was not too dissimilar from some kind of pen, whereby second years were introduced to the harsh realities of being on a yard with older boys, invariably getting duffed up in their first few days on that yard until they understood the natural order of matters and fitted in. I shall tell you more on another occasion about when an older individual sought to inflict physical violence on me. But the second, third, and fourth year boys were placed upon this yard, which was separate from all the other yards. It was connected to the other yards by a set of steps, which made it very easy for patrolling teachers to keep second, third, and fourth year boys where they were deemed to belong. The second, third, and fourth year girls had a yard which was between and around two of the wings of the school. They were able to stand against a fence and wave down at the boys, sending glances of wantonness, desire, waving, blowing kisses, etc., as the boys pressed themselves up against the fence. It was a wire fence, so they would be able to poke part of their face through it, and it was easy to see through, but it kept them in place. Occasionally, some mad fool would decide that they wanted to go and talk to the girls during a break time, and they would make a break for the border. There was only one unlocked gate from this yard, and they would have to rush through it and then try and race up the embankment to get to the wooden fence on which the relevant girl or girls were leaning. This meant that they were easily exposed as they darted across the expanse of green, which resulted in a sharp blow of a whistle and whichever teacher was on patrol yelling, "You boy, back to the yard!" And thus they had to turn and walk back. This invariably brought with them jeers from the bottom yard, the shame often translating to blushing cheeks as the offender had been caught and had to return. But what this all did was mean that, aside from in the first year, as those raging hormones started to take a hold upon those adolescents, that second, third, and fourth year boys and girls were largely kept apart from one another at times that they might begin to explore one another. They, of course, could not do so particularly well in class, not least in attracting the attention of a teacher. And this, of course, meant that having access to nooks and crannies, away from prying eyes, away from the beaks of the teachers, was a particular advantage. Having somewhere that could be accessed and also locked, so that nobody could enter, was a particular boon, and it was one that I used to my advantage. I remember that September, as we returned to school and the fifth year had commenced. Summer gave way to autumn, and on the top field it would often be the case that later in the day the incinerator was being used by the caretaker, burning the leaves, burning the wood, the scent of wood smoke drifting across that football field, as the weakening sunlight percolated through the thinning trees. Also, it was the opportunity for exploration. My girlfriend at the time went by the nickname of Glowworm. This was because she was easily embarrassed, and her cheeks would turn red. She was a pretty girl, of similar height to me, quite tall. She had hazel eyes, round, inquisitive. She had full breasts. Yet she was somewhat shy. But it was necessary for me to want to experience more of her, to firm my hold over her, by wanting to embark upon the embrace and the exploration of that body of hers. Naturally, prior to that, and we'd known each other for a number of years, one had been prevented from doing so because of the exclusionary tactics of the yards. We were now in the 5th year, which meant, of course, that we were housed in the wing, but that still made it difficult because there were scores of other pupils, other 5th years, wandering around, and therefore finding a place where you could engage in a snog and a grope would be particularly difficult. Were there not a patrolling teacher, there would undoubtedly be a squawking fellow pupil. But this is where the stockroom came in handy, and I persuaded her that she ought to meet me by one, which was adjacent to where the games rooms were, the changing rooms. There, very few people would be around a break time, and it was there that she met me, looking furtively around, as I then smiled at her and took out the key. "Are we going in there, HG?" she said. I nodded. She started to blush, already with the anticipation of what she thought would take place in there, but I was pleased to say she did not demur. I unlocked the door of this particular stockroom and indicated for her to go in. She complied, and I followed her. I decided against switching on the light, instead allowing a little of the weak autumnal sunlight that came from a small window above to provide the lighting for this encounter. I turned and closed the door, inserting the key into the lock, and then turned to her. She stood, expectant, eyes staring at me and then down to the floor. Even in the weakened light I could see that her name Glowworm was once again apt as her cheeks glowed. I slipped the keys back into my pocket and then moved towards her. I hugged her against me, feeling the round firmness of her breasts as they pressed into my chest. And then, as I slipped my hand around her back, and my other hand began to caress the back of her neck, I pulled back slightly and embraced her. This was, of course, something that I had done many, many times with many other people, but for her, she was less experienced, and already the little whimpers of delight and desire were being made by her. It enabled me to kiss her hard, and for a long time, my hands exploring her. At first, there was a slight resistance, as if she thought she was doing something offensive, but she soon gave in to the sensations that were clearly sweeping her body. And, of course, all of this was entirely uninterrupted. Thus, the stockrooms became my little bolt holes, where a succession of girls from the school could be lured to ensure that we would engage in some affectionate activity. But it did not end there. I also recognized that there was another advantage to be had from access to these stockrooms. For whilst it provided me with privacy to engage in exploration of girlfriends and other girls within the year, it was also an opportunity for me to offer this service to my friends. Again, the opportunities to necessarily meet after school were limited, and it was still at a time when necessarily parents might have a strict view as to fraternization, and therefore any opportunity to, in effect, get their rocks off was seized upon, all for the very favourable charge of 50 pence. Accordingly, at a break time, you would be able to obtain 10 minutes in the stockroom for 50 pence with your relevant girlfriend, or perhaps even someone who was about to be your girlfriend, and lure them in there I would lock the couple inside. And I remember on the first occasion deciding that I would view what was going on, to see what they were getting up to enjoy the show. I knelt down and peered in through the keyhole. Unfortunately, the light within the room was insufficient to give me a clear view through the constrictive space, and in the circumstances I readily gave up the endeavour. Nevertheless, it enabled me to pocket the money that was provided on numerous occasions, and meant that at the end of the week there was a healthy sum that was going to be lodged in the bank of HG. But also it was of worth because I kept a record of who was with who, particularly those that I knew that were fraternising with someone that wasn't their girlfriend. Such information, of course, was always extremely useful for ensuring that friends continued to be friends in the fullest of ways, ensuring that those favours that your glorious narrator required to be done were executed just as he required them to be done. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.